Hello everyone, if you are completely new to Unreal Engine 5, then this tutorial was made for you. In this tutorial, you will go from knowing nothing about Unreal Engine 5 to creating this beautiful world you see right here. Now, I know this might look intimidating, but do not worry. Every step in this process, from sculpting the landscape to creating the castle, will be shown in detail. This video is pretty long, but that's because Unreal Engine 5 is a big program, and we have a lot to cover. To help navigate this video, I divided it up into individual chapters. You can find links to all the chapters in the description below. In this tutorial, you will learn how to install Unreal Engine 5 and create a project, how to navigate and move objects in your 3D world, create materials and import 3D models, go over Unreal's amazing new dynamic lighting system called Lumen, sculpt landscapes and paint foliage, download free nanite objects from the Megascans library, and finally we will briefly go over how to program a game using blueprints, and at the end, create the fantasy environment you see right here. I know learning Unreal Engine 5 can be tough at first, which is why each chapter in this video can be treated as its own self-contained lesson. So if you're ever stuck on something, you can always go back in the video and re-watch that chapter. Also, all the assets I use in this video are completely free, so you can follow along with me. Now, with all that being said, let's jump into UE5. To begin, before we can use Unreal Engine 5, of course we have to download Unreal Engine 5. To do so, you need the Epic Games Launcher. You can get it from their website, and come all the way down here to the Unreal Engine tab. Now, with the tabs up here, you want to click on Library, and if you don't see Unreal Engine 5, then you don't have it downloaded. To download it, you want to click on the plus icon next to Engine Versions, and make sure you have 5 selected, and then click on Install. Now, it's going to ask for an install location. You can just leave it at the default place, but if you do want to bring it somewhere else, then you can click on Browse and select a new location. But I'm just going to leave it default and click Install. Once Unreal Engine 5 is done downloading, all you have to do to open up is to click Launch, or you could click Launch up here, but Unreal Engine 5 isn't set as the default engine. You can set it as the default engine by clicking on the dropdown and selecting Unreal Engine 5. Alternatively, if you don't want to go through the Epic Games Launcher, you can click on the dropdown right here and create a shortcut on your desktop. Now that shortcut has been created, let's open up Unreal Engine 5 by just double clicking on the application. The Unreal Project Browser will pop up when you open up Unreal Engine. Essentially, this is where we open up recent projects, or we create a project completely from scratch, which is what we're going to be doing. Now, you can create your project from a template, which essentially is a pre-made project to help point you in the right direction with a lot of stuff already done for you. For example, if you're in the car industry and you want to render out a car, then possibly going into the Automotive tab and selecting Photo Studio will be a good template from where you will start. But for our cases, I want to start from complete scratch. So I'm going to come to Games and make sure I select Blank. Now down here is the project location where our project is going to be saved. I just want to save this on the desktop. If you do want to save it somewhere else, then you can click on the file icon right here and browse to a different folder. Now right here is the project name. So let's call this one First Project. And up here are some project settings. Now I'm going to leave it at Blueprint since we're not going to be going over C++ coding in this video. And down here, I want to make sure starter content is enabled. Starter content will give us some nice assets that we can play with to help us learn Unreal Engine 5. Below that is ray tracing. We're not going to go over ray tracing just yet. And of course, to create this project, let's click on Create. So this is what you should see when opening up Unreal Engine for the first time. Don't worry, we're going to go over what all these different windows and buttons do in just a second. But before that, I want to go over how Unreal Engine stores projects. So let's exit out of this project, and we can see that a brand new folder was created on our desktop. Remember, I selected my desktop as the place to save our project. Essentially, this folder contains all the data that makes up our project. So whenever we make a change in our project or we create something in the project, it's going to be stored right here. Now to open up our project again, all you have to do is double click on the .u project asset right there. And that will open up your project from where you last saved it. To begin, let's briefly go over how to navigate the user interface and what all these different windows do. So probably the window that sticks out the most is the viewport right here. The viewport is essentially just a view into our 3D world that we're creating. So for example, we can fly around and look at our world. We can even grab objects and manipulate them all within the 3D viewport. Now, don't worry, we are going to go over camera controls and how to move objects in just a bit. But I first want to go over what the different windows do. Right above the viewport is the toolbar. The toolbar is pretty important because it's where we get a lot of our tools and a lot of different buttons we're going to be continually pressing. For example, what if I want to add an object into our world? Then I can click on the plus icon and scroll down to shapes, and maybe I add in a sphere and place it in the world to move it around. I can also switch modes. So right now I'm in select mode, which is the main mode where we can move objects around. Let's say if I'm making a landscape, I can go into landscaping mode and create a landscape. Or I can go into foliage mode and start to paint foliage if I do have those assets. If you are curious, we are going to go over both modes later in the video. Now to the right of that, we have the outliner. The outliner is essentially a list of all the objects that make up my current world. So for example, if I want to select a chair, but the chair isn't in my view right now within the outliner, I can select the chair right there like that. I can also select multiple objects by holding down Control. So maybe I want to select both chairs, just hold down Control like that, and maybe also the statue right there. The outliner is also a great place to organize your world. For example, we have all these folders. Real quickly, if you want to create a folder, all you have to do is right click, create folder. Let's call this one My Folder, and holding down Control, let's select both chairs and simply drag them into there just like this. We can also hide and unhide objects. For example, maybe I want to edit something that's behind the table, but the table's in the way right now. I can come here and temporarily click on the eye icon to hide the table, and then click on the eye icon again to unhide it. And right below the world outliner, we have the details panel. The details panel is essentially where we can edit all the properties of an object that we have selected. For example, maybe if I don't like the scale of this chair right here, I can select the chair and come to scale and maybe increase it by 2 in the Z axis, which is the vertical axis, and see that we have a really long and tall chair. Now, I don't like that edit. It looks kind of weird. So you can always press Ctrl and Z in Unreal Engine to undo anything. Now, we do have one more default window. That's arguably the most important window since it stores everything we're doing. It stores information on the chairs, the table, even the entire world. And that is the content drawer. You can get the content drawer by going all the way down here to the bottom left-hand corner and clicking on content drawer like that to bring it up. Alternatively, since this window is pretty important, you can press Ctrl and space at the same time to bring it up and close it. So if you press Ctrl and space, it's going to bring up the content drawer, and this gives us a folder view of all the assets that make up our project. So for example, if we want to see where this chair is being stored and maybe we want to edit the chair, then we can come under starter content, props, and right there we have SM_chair. If I double click on it, we can see the chair asset and make any adjustments if we do need to. Now we're going to go over the static mesh editor later, so I can exit out of this window by clicking on the X icon. I'm going to press Ctrl and space again to bring back my content drawer, and probably the best example I have for the content drawer is that it's like your computer's file explorer. So just like on your computer where you have folders, and in those folders you have subfolders, and those subfolders contain assets like text files or Word documents, same exact thing with the content drawer in Unreal. So you have folders, and in those folders you have subfolders, and finally you have all those assets that make up your project. So for example, here we have the starter content folder, and I can go into it by double clicking like this, or I can click on it right here within the folder window. Now I could go into any of these different folders. For example, the maps folder contains the map we're currently editing. So we can see up here that this map is called minimal_default. Right there's minimal_default. We can double check that we are editing this map by double clicking on it to open it up. Let's go save. And we can see that it did open up the exact same map. Now, if I ever want to go up a folder, I can always click on here. So right now we're in the maps folder. If I want to get out of that, I can click on starter content. And if I want to get out of that, we can even go to content right there. Now, don't worry, if you don't have starter content, you can click on add and then add feature or content pack, and then go to content and simply select starter content and add a project. I'm not going to do that since we did add it when we were creating our project. As you can guess, the content drawer is a pretty big deal. And maybe you don't want to press Ctrl and space all the time to bring it up. You always want it docked in your layout. Well, all you have to do is click on docked in layout like this. And now your content drawer will be right here at the bottom. And notice how it's called content browser right now, not called content drawer. So whenever I say content browser and content drawer, just know that I'm talking about the same exact thing. Now, this is great, but this tab right here is taking up a little bit of real estate. If you ever want to get rid of a tab, all you have to do is right click and click on hide tabs. If you want to get back that tab, then you can click on the very small blue triangle and that will bring back your tab. Also, tabs are great because if you left mouse button and hold, you're able to move this around and dock it somewhere else. So maybe if I don't want content browser at the bottom right here, I can dock it to the side, or I can even dock it to one of the tabs right here. And now I'm able to switch in between details and the content browser. Also, if you ever want to move windows around, you can hover in between the windows and then you're able to move it down just like this to adjust exactly how you want your user interface. Now, another neat trick is that if I dock my content browser right here, and let's go make it a little bit smaller, and maybe I don't want it always visible, I can right click and go dock to sidebar. Now, whenever I want my content browser or any other window, I can just click right here and it will show. Now, if I don't want to dock to sidebar, I can right click and unlock from sidebar just like that. Now I'm going to click on the X icon to get rid of that content browser. Alternatively, if I want to automatically dock all my windows in a sidebar except the viewport, I can click on F10, which will go into full screen mode. And now we can see that my outliner and details window and any other windows I have on the side will go into docked mode. And then I can click on F10 again to bring those windows back. So F10 is a neat shortcut to automatically dock all your windows. Now, these are just the default windows. If you want to see all the windows that are available to us, we can come up to Windows and select any of these. Now, one window that we are going to be using a lot is the world settings. So world settings, as you can guess, just has a bunch of different properties and settings that we can play with to edit the map we currently have opened. Now, for example, what if we really mess up our user interface? It's basically unreadable. We have no idea what is happening. Don't worry, we can always come up to Window and all the way down here, go to Load Layout and click on Default Editor Layout, which will just reset all of our windows. Now that we have the very basics of the user interface out of the way, we can move on to the fun stuff, and that is camera navigation. So how to navigate our camera around our 3D world so we can view it at all different angles. To navigate is actually easier than you think. So you want your cursor inside the viewport, and then you want to hold down the right mouse button. If you now move your mouse with the right mouse button held down, you are able to look around your scene. And still, with the right mouse button held down, you're able to use the WASD keys to move around. You can also use E and Q to go up and down. So that's E to go up, Q to go down, W to move forward, S to move backwards, and A and D to move left and right, all the while holding down the right mouse button. If you are not holding down the right mouse button and you try to use WASD, then nothing will happen. So make sure you do hold that down. Now we can also control our camera speed. So let's say, for example, there's an object that's really far away and you want to go towards that object, but your camera is moving too slow. Well, if you come up here to the top right-hand corner and select the camera icon, you're now able to control that speed. So right now we're at 4. We can also bring this up to 6. And now we are a lot faster. And we can bring this all the way down to 1. And we can see that we are pretty slow. So let's leave it at 4. And a shortcut to access camera speed is to, of course, hold down the right mouse button and use the scroll wheel. So scroll wheel up will move faster and scroll wheel down will move slower. So that's a shortcut. That's so you don't have to come up here and continually play with the camera speed if you do want to move faster or slower. Here's a really good tip. Let's say if you scroll really far away, so you fly really far away from where the bulk of your geometry, where your world is, and then you look around and you can't find your objects anymore. What you can do is come up to any of the objects right here. Let's say, for example, the chair, select that, and then press the F key to focus on that object. So if you select an object, you can press F to then snap to that object, just like this. So that's how you're never lost in your world. So if you ever played any first-person games, you should be right at home since the muscle memory is there for the WASD keys and rotating your camera by moving your mouse. Now, if we press F again to then zoom in onto an object, we can rotate around that object by holding down Alt and the left mouse button. So Alt and left mouse button allows us to rotate around a pivot object. And if we hold down Alt and hold down the right mouse button, we can zoom in and out. So right mouse button, zoom in and out, left mouse button to pivot around that object. And to focus on an object, of course, we want to select it and press the F key just like beforehand. Before we move on, let's briefly go over the viewport controls. So we know the different ways that we can view our world. So up here we have perspective. Let's say if you want a top-down bird's eye view, then we could click on the perspective button and select top like this. So to control in an orthographic view mode, you want to hold down the right mouse button to pan, and of course use a scroll wheel to zoom in and out. So right mouse button pan scroll wheel to zoom in and out. We can also view it from the side, like maybe the left side, same controls. And of course, if we want to go back into perspective, we come up here, select the button, and click on perspective. Notice how a lot of the buttons in Unreal have a shortcut right next to it. For example, perspective shortcut is Alt and G. So instead of coming all the way up here and selecting perspective in the dropdown, I can just press the Alt and G key at the same time to go back into perspective. So right next to perspective is our view modes. So view modes are pretty great because they allow us to see our world in different ways. For example, maybe we don't want to see all the lights and we just want to see the colors of our world. Instead of coming up to lit, I can select unlit right there, or I can even select wireframe to see our world's edges and vertices. We will be changing our view modes a lot since it's a great way to debug our scene and see if there's anything wrong. So I'm going to come back up here to lit, or the shortcuts are Alt-4 for lit, Alt-3 for unlit, and Alt-2 for wireframe. So let's jump back with Alt and 4 to get our default view. And right next to our view modes is the show flags. So show flags allow us to turn on and off different object types. For example, what if I don't want this grid right here at the bottom? Then I can come to show, let's go find where grid is, and uncheck that to hide the grid. Now maybe for some reason you don't want to show our static meshes, and essentially static meshes are all the objects you see right here. Then within the show flags, we can uncheck static meshes, and we no longer see those static meshes. Now, obviously we don't want that, and if you ever mess up your show flags, you can bring back the default flags by clicking on Use Defaults. And keep in mind that we aren't deleting anything with show flags, they just help us see what we want in the viewport. And finally, this is my favorite viewport option, and that is Game View. So if we come up here and click on the button with the 3 lines, we have Game View all the way down here, and we can see that the shortcut is G. Now, if I enable Game View, we're going to see exactly what the player will see in game. So if I press G to untoggle Game View, we can see that we have all these different widgets, and we have the grid right here. And of course, the player won't see the sun widget right here, which controls the sun's rotation. Instead, if we want to see exactly what the game will see, we click on G to hide all those widgets and features that are here for us, the editor. So just know that throughout this tutorial, when you see a bunch of widgets and these widgets just disappear, that's because I toggled on Game View with the G key. Now that we know how to navigate around our world, it's time to go over how to create new objects and move them around. So we're going to go over moving, scaling, and rotating objects. To begin, let's go over simple movement. I'm going to press a G key to get rid of our editor widgets. And now all we see is our world. So to move an object, simply select it. And by default, we get the translation or the movement gizmo. To move an object, hover over any of these arrows and hold down the left mouse button. So I'm able to move this chair around, but notice how moving the chair isn't smooth. That's because by default, snapping is turned on. Now you could turn off snapping by coming up here and unchecking the grid icon like that. So now we can smoothly move our objects around. Now I'm going to turn it back on because it's important to know that Unreal uses centimeters. So right now, since there's a 10 right next to the icon, it's snapping every 10 centimeters. We can change this by selecting the number, and in the dropdown, let's select 100. So now it's moving every 100 centimeters, which is 1 meter. So every time this chair moves, it moves 1 meter. So that's pretty important to know. Now I'm going to uncheck it because I do want smooth movement. Next up is rotation. So to rotate your object, you want to change its gizmo. To change a gizmo, you want to select one of the buttons up here. So right now it's on translation. Right next to it is rotation. Now I can rotate this chair in all these different axes. We can see that rotation snapping is turned on. If I want to turn that off, then right next to translation snapping, we have this icon right here. Make sure it's not blue. And now we're no longer snapping every 10 degrees. I can press Ctrl Z to undo all those changes. And let's go over scaling. So right next to rotation, we have scaling. And scaling works pretty similar to the rest of the gizmos. All you have to do is hover over any of these squares, hold down the left mouse button, and now we're going to scale in that exact direction. So if we want to turn off scale snapping, of course, just uncheck the icon right there, and now we can smoothly scale. I'll press Ctrl Z a bit because it's important to point out that if I hover my mouse not over one of the individual squares, but the one square that's connecting all of them, so the one in the middle, hold down the left mouse button, I can move my chair and scale it uniformly up and down. So not in any particular axis. So I press Ctrl Z to undo all those. And if we hover over all these buttons, we see that there's shortcuts. So movement is W, rotation is E, and scaling is R. So that means it's W to move, E to rotate, and R to scale. So those are some of the most common shortcuts that we're going to be using consistently throughout our time in Unreal Engine. So again, one last time, it is W to move, E to rotate, and R to scale. I also want to point out that if we want to move our object in the direction of our object, then come up to this little globe icon, select it. That's how it's now a square. And we can see that we're now able to move the object in that object's direction. So move it locally instead of globally. If we want to switch it back to global, then click the square icon again to make it a globe. And now we're moving it in the direction of the world and not that individual object. It's also important to point out that if I press W to get our translation widget, and if I hover over the square that's in between the different axes, I'm able to lock it and move it only in those two axes. So if I hover in between the Y and X axis, I'm just moving it in between those and not in the Z axis. I can also lock it in between the Z and Y axis, just like this. So let's press Ctrl and Z to undo those changes. Now you're probably wondering, how do we create an object in our world? Well, there's a couple ways. Number one is that we can duplicate an object. So with any object selected, for example, this statue, if I press Ctrl and D, then we just duplicate that object. Now, we didn't notice a change. That's because it duplicated it in the same spot as the original object. So if I hold down the left mouse button and move it out of the way, we can see that we did duplicate that object. And within the outliner, there's now a new object called statue 2, which is a copy of the original statue. So let's delete statue 2. And there is an easier way to duplicate. And this is the way I duplicate. And that is hovering over an arrow with a translation widget selected and holding down Alt and left mouse button. So hold down both of those and simply drag. And now we're able to easily duplicate and drag an object away. So let's press Ctrl Z to undo all those changes. Now, another way to create an object is by using the Add tool up here in the toolbar. So for example, let's click on Add and let's come all the way down here to Shapes, and maybe we want to drag in a sphere. So we drag it in like this, or we can even add in a light, like a point light, and we're able to drag it around in our scene. So let's go delete those. And finally, the last way to add an object is through the content browser. So let's bring up the browser by holding down Control and Space at the same time, pressing both of those. And let's go into props. And to add an object into the content browser, hold down the left mouse button and drag it into your world. For example, this couch. So let's go move it down just like this. And now we have a brand new object. So by holding down Shift, you can select multiple objects. So for example, if I have my chair on the left selected, and I want to select the chair on the right, if I hold down Shift, now I have them both selected. If I hold down Shift again, I can add in the table and the statue. Now, if I want to deselect an item, all I have to do is hold down Control and click on any items to deselect them. Now, all we have is the statue and the left chair selected. And here's another tip. If I have the chair selected, hold down Alt and the left mouse button to drag out a new chair. Let's say if I want to drag this chair all the way over there, then I'm going to have to drag it across the screen, move my camera, drag it across my screen again, and it's just a huge hassle. Another way I can do it is by holding down the Shift while I'm dragging. So if I'm going to hold down the left mouse button on one of these arrows and I want to lock my camera to the object, simply hold down Shift and you're able to lock a camera to an object, which can save on a lot of time. So I'm going to press delete and let's create a very, very simple scene just to get a hang of all the controls. So to begin, I want to hold down Shift and let's select these two chairs. Hold down Alt and duplicate them out. So let go, hold down Alt and left mouse button again, Alt and left mouse button again. Now let's go rotate some of these chairs. That's how they're facing inwards. So select a chair, press E to get the rotation gizmo up and have them all face inside. just like this. Again, it doesn't have to be pretty perfect because we're just trying to get used to the controls at this point. And then I'm going to select the table, press R to scale it. And I want to elongate the table just a little bit, maybe even in its x-axis. Press E again. Let's rotate this. Press W, move it into the middle right there. Select the chair, hold down Shift. Let's select the other chair and move them all in. Let's select the statue, move it into the middle. Press R, scale this up, and maybe add some lamps on both sides of the table. So press Control and space. Within our content, starter content, and props, we have this SM_lamp ceiling. If I drag it in, this is exactly what I want, but right now it's in the opposite direction. So I want this to be placed on the ground. I can press E, rotate this, and try to get to 180 degrees. Or I can press Control Z and re-enable snapping for rotation right here. And rotate it exactly -180 degrees, which is what I want. So press W and let's move it. That's how it's directly placed against the ground, like right here. So I could try to guess exactly where it is, or I could snap any object I have selected to the object that's directly below it by pressing the end key. So that's END, not the end letter. So press END, end, and snap it there just like that. So press R again, scale this up in the Z axis, hold down Alt, and drag it in both the Y and X axis right there like this. Let's hold down Shift again and drag both of those across our world just like that. And I would say congratulations, you now have a very, very simple level. This is definitely not the best map, but it is pretty good as a first level. Now that you've finished your first level, it's time to move on to the post-process volume. So we're going to go over how we can change the settings of our viewport camera, specifically exposure. While in the process of creating our first level, you might have noticed that if we zoom into the shadows, we see our screen gets brighter and brighter and brighter. And then when we zoom out, our screen gets darker. So that is auto exposure. And what exposure is trying to do is that it's trying to mimic the way our eyes work. So for example, if you've ever been in a very dark room and you decide to jump out into the daylight, you can feel your eyes start to hurt and everything is really bright, but slowly over time your eyes start to adjust until everything comes into focus. And that is exactly what Unreal Engine is trying to mimic by brightening our screen and darkening our screen. So I think we can create a better example by duplicating this map and creating a little house. So to do so, let's press Control and space to go into our content drawer. And I want to duplicate minimal_default, which is right now located in starter content and maps. So right here is the current level that we have. There's a little asterisk right next to it, and that tells us that it needs to be saved. So press Control S to save the level, and to duplicate the level, simply press Control and D to duplicate. Now let's go rename this to post process example, and let's go save it. So if I double click on minimal_default, this is the current map that we've been on. And then if I double click on post process example, this is the new map that we're about to edit. Now notice that our grid is pretty large right now. That's because we have our snapping set to 100. We can make the grid squares smaller by setting this back to 10 as its default. So now our grid is a little bit smaller, or you can press G to hide all those editor widgets. Now I want to start deleting all these objects. So simply select an object and delete it to get rid of it. And here is a little tip. If I go into the outliner, since I do want to delete all these chairs, I could hold down Control and select each chair individually, or I can select the first chair at the very top of the list, hold down Shift, and select the last one, and then it'll select everything in between. So Control is to select individual objects, and hold down Shift is to select a row of objects. And press Delete. Now let's create a little hut. So I'm going to come up to Add, and hold down the left mouse button on Cube to add in a very simple cube. Keep in mind that this is just for demonstrations to show exposure, so this won't be the best. Hold down Alt, let's go duplicate this wall, and hold down Alt again. Press E, and I want to make sure snapping is turned on so I can rotate this exactly 90 degrees right there. Hold down Alt again, and drag it out just like this. So hold down Alt, rotate this as a roof. And I do want a slight opening so that the sun can come through and illuminate the inside of this hut. Right here, like that. So now, notice that if I zoom in on this and go inside the hut, we can see our screen get brighter and brighter and brighter. And then as soon as I fly out, our screen gets darker. So when I go inside, our eyes adjust, it gets lighter so that we can see exactly what is inside the hut. And then if I zoom outside, our eyes get darker. Now, this can be annoying if you are building out worlds. So to turn it off and to lock your screen to a certain brightness, we could come up to lit and all the way down here under exposure, uncheck game settings. Now we have a constant brightness that even if I go inside the hut, we see that our screen isn't getting darker. Now, right underneath game settings, we have EV100. If I bring this down, our screen gets brighter. And if I bring this up, our screen gets darker. So we can leave it at 0 for now. Now, there is just one issue, and that is this change doesn't apply to gameplay. To play the game, come up to the toolbar and click on the play icon. Now we are currently in game. But if we, let's say, go into the hut, we see auto exposure is turned on since our screen gets brighter, and when I leave, the screen gets darker. On a side note, if you want to stop playing the game, press the escape key to exit out. Maybe this is what you want. When you're building out your world, you have a constant exposure, and then when you're in game, you have auto exposure turned on. But if you do want to edit the exposure directly in game, this is where post-process volumes come in handy. Now, we won't be able to see the exposure changes with the post-process volume, with game settings turned off, so come up to lit and make sure game settings is turned on again. And within the outliner, by default, we will have a global post-process volume for this map. So with the post-process volume selected within the outliner, we see that we have a drop-down called exposure, and we have exposure compensation. Now, in order to edit any of these properties, you want to make sure that they are turned on first, and then we're able to adjust exposure, but auto exposure is still turned on right now. So what we can do is select metering mode, and instead of auto exposure histogram, select manual. Now we control exactly what our exposure is with the exposure compensation. So if we leave it at 9, press play again, we see that we don't have any auto exposure in game. So you might be wondering exactly what the post-process volume is. Well, the post-process volume is a great way to add some effects after everything has been rendered. So the post-process volume only affects our camera. For example, maybe we want some more bloom. So we select bloom, and right now the intensity is at 0.675. I can boost this up all the way to, let's say, 8. And maybe if I want the default values back, instead of trying to guess what the default values are, I could come over here and select that backwards arrow, which will set everything back to its default value. We also have a bunch of other settings. For example, under image effects, we can add a very strong vignette. So right now it's at 0.4. We can bring this up all the way to 1. So there's a lot of darkening around the sides of the camera. Or we can completely turn off vignettes by bringing it down to 0. So by default, Unreal does have a little bit of vignettes with it being at 0.4. We can also go down here and change some of the color grading. So maybe if I select saturation, I can move the wheel around. And we see just a little bit of changes. I can even boost the saturation down here. So instead of 1, drag this up. And now we have a really vibrant and saturated scene. And of course, I can uncheck this to get rid of that change. So if you want, there are a ton of different settings. You can go through and see what all of them are. But you might be wondering, how do I create a post-process volume if I don't have it inside of our world? So to begin, I'm going to press G key to bring back all of our editor widgets, select the post-process volume, and let's delete it so we can go over how to create a post-process volume from scratch. Of course, we're going to select the add button. It's going to be under volumes. Down here, we have post-process volume. So simply drag this into our world and we see that we have a little square. So let's make a very quick change. So the change I want to make is down here within globals and saturation. Instead of 1, I'm going to change this to 0. But we notice that there are no changes to our camera right now. That's because the post-process volume, by default, only affects whatever is inside the post-process volume. So if we move into the cube, we can see those changes taking into effect. And right now, by changing global saturation, bringing it down all the way to 0, it gives us a black and white world. Now, what if I want this post-process volume to affect our entire world? Well, scroll all the way down here, and under Infinite Extent Unbound, make sure that's turned on. So that's how we don't have to be within the post-process volume for that post-process volume to take effect. Now it's time to go over materials, but do keep in mind that materials can be a little bit complicated, especially if you're brand new to 3D art. So if you do find yourself a little bit lost throughout this course, do keep in mind that you can always go back in a section and rewatch it. To demonstrate materials, I want to create a brand new map. So to do so, let's create a folder where we're going to store all the assets we create. So I want this folder to be under content, right next to the starter content folder. Right click and select new folder. I'm going to call this folder my stuff and double click to go inside of it. Now to create a level, I could right click and under create basic assets, select level, but I want to use a level template since this will just create a completely blank level. So to use level templates, you want to come up to file, new level, and you can select open world or basic. I'm going to select basic. And now we have a pretty basic level. It's just the floor right here and the sky. Now, in order to save this level in a specific location in our content browser, you need to press Ctrl and S. And it's going to ask us where we want to save this level. Select my stuff. And let's call this one material example level. And then select save. Now, pressing Ctrl and space to bring up my content drawer, we can see that under my stuff, our level is saved. So if we ever want to go back into this level, I just have to double click and we will open up that level. Now, I do want to make some adjustments. If we zoom in on the floor, we can see that our grid is showing through and it's right on top of the floor. Now, this grid will be distracting when we're showing off materials. So I'm going to come up to show and uncheck the grid to hide it. That's how all we see is the floor material. Also, I think this floor is a little bit too big for our purposes. So I could use R and hover in between the Y and X axis to then scale it down like this. Or alternatively, within the details panel of this floor, I can set it to 1 in the x-axis, 1 in the y-axis, and 1 in the z-axis, just to give us a smaller floor. I also want to add in an object to place our materials on top of, and we can do so by pressing Ctrl and space. And Unreal actually comes with a bunch of assets and objects by default. So this is content that is not located in starter content. Instead, it's located in the engine folder. And if you don't see your engine folder right here, that's because you need to come to settings and make sure show engine content is enabled. Now we get access to all of Unreal's default content that is contained in every single project. So let's go into content, and I believe it is under engine meshes, and it's specifically SM_map preview mesh. Now we can also select engine and type in SM_mat to bring up that asset. So I'm going to drag it into our world, and let's rotate it 90 degrees. And we can rotate it 90 degrees exactly by making sure snapping is enabled up here. Now I also want to control the exposure, since if we zoom in on the shadows and zoom out, we can see that auto exposure is enabled right now. So let's create a post-process volume by going to volumes, post-process, simply dragging it out. I want this to affect the entire world, not just whatever is inside this box. So scroll down and make sure Infinite Extend Bound is turned on. Now, if we go up here under exposure, make sure metering mode is set to manual instead of auto, and exposure compensation, we can bring this up. I found a value of 11 to be pretty good. Now, as a reminder, if your exposure isn't changing from your post-process volume, you need to make sure that in lit, game setting is turned on, because otherwise it's going to default to EV100 setting right here as the exposure amount. So make sure game view is turned on. That's how we're using post-process volume. And since I do like my scene right now, you want to make sure to save everything with Control and S. And actually, I think I'm going to bring down my exposure to Let's leave it at 10.5. So now it's finally time to go over materials. And adding a material to your world is actually pretty simple. So press Control Space, and luckily starter content comes with a bunch of materials by default under the materials folder. So let's double click into materials, and we see we have a bunch of materials that we can use. So to add a material to our world, you want to simply hold down the left mouse button and drag it until you're hovering over whatever object you want this material to be placed on, and let go. It is that simple. So now we have a brick floor, or for example, to make this object steel, I can drag a steel material onto the object and let go. We can even add grass right there like this. And we can see the reflections updates on the metal right there whenever we are switching our different materials, which is pretty cool. So let's select the grass. And I do actually want to make this just a little bit bigger. So let's scale it in X and Y axis like this. And I think the screen is too bright. So I'm going to bring its exposure compensation down to 10.25. So that's the basics of adding a material to our world. What if we want to create or edit a material? Well, to create a material is also pretty simple. It's just like creating a level. Press Control and Space and come into My Stuff where we're going to create our material. Right click, and under Create Basic Asset, select Material, and let's call this First Material. And press Enter and double click on it to open up the material editor. First off, before we go over any of these settings, you'll notice that my window is right now floating. So something I like to do with all my editor windows is to hold down the left mouse button on the tab and then dock it up here just like this. That's how really quickly I could switch in between my main level view and any of my editor views. So in the middle, we have the material graph. Essentially what the material graph does is basically we have a bunch of nodes that connect to each other, and their end goal is to eventually be outputted into one of these outputs right here, which will create the actual material. Now the controls are pretty similar to the controls of our viewport when in orthographic view mode. So hold down the right mouse button to pan, and then use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out. So right mouse button pan, scroll wheel zoom in and out. You can select nodes by just clicking on them or holding down the left mouse button to marquee select. Now to the left right here is the viewport. If you hold down the left mouse button, you can pan around this preview mesh right here, which helps us see our material when we're editing it. Now we can change the preview mesh down here. So maybe you want to use a cylinder or a flat plane, a square, but for now I'm just going to keep it at a sphere. And right below that is the details panel. So if we select a node, we're able to edit that node's properties right here in the details panel. So how do we create a node? Well, we come all the way over here to the palette, click on it, and now we have a selection of all the different nodes we can use to create a material. We can also right click anywhere to get that same palette. So under palette, I want a constant 3 vector under constant. The reason why is because a constant 3 vector is essentially Unreal's version of color. It's R, G, and B for red, green, and blue. Right now this node is set to black. I could edit it by coming to the details panel and double clicking on the color to get a color picker, or I could double click on the node itself to get that color wheel. So notice how when I do change the color right here, there are no changes. That's because its value is set to 0. I can bring up its value by clicking on this rectangle right here. So now when I change this color, we notice that color changing. And when I do like a color, I want to confirm that this node is going to stay that color by clicking OK. So now we have our first node with a new color. Essentially, if I hover over this pin right here and hold down the left mouse button, I'm able to drag out a wire. And I can choose where I want to place these wires in any of the inputs right here. Now, of course, because this is a color, it should probably go into base color. So with my left mouse button still held down, I'm going to hover over the base color pin and let go to connect it. Now we can see that our color is affecting our material. So let's see what this looks like in our level. So press Control and Space, and let's drag first material onto the sphere, and notice that there are no changes right now. This looks like the default material. And that's because we first need to compile our material after we make any changes to see that change in our level. So go to first material, and to compile a material, you want to click on the apply button. And also while we're at it, let's save it. So if Unreal crashes, we don't lose our progress. Now, if we come back to our level, we can see that change took effect. Now jumping back into first material, If we, let's say, change the color to a light blue, jump back into our level, we see that there were no changes because we need to make sure after we edit a material that we compile it with the apply button. And now we see that light blue. That's how you add color. Now, what if you want to edit how shiny or reflective the material is? Well, on our first material, instead of editing the base color, we're now going to edit the roughness channel right here. And roughness doesn't take a color value, of course. Instead, it takes a scalar value in between 0 and 1. So 0 means it's really smooth, and 1 means it's really rough. To get a scalar value, you want to come up to Palette, and under Constant, select the Constant 1 value. Left mouse button hold, and drag it out. And now we get a node that is simply a number. So 0 will be smooth, 1 will be rough. Let's make this really smooth by giving it a value of 0.1. And simply left mouse button hold and drag it into roughness. If for some reason you ever want to break a wire, all you have to do is hold down Alt and hover over any of these pins and left click. So Alt and left click to break any pins. And we will not see this change in our level unless we press apply. So jumping back into materials, I'm going to press F and hold down Alt and left mouse button to then pivot around my material, all its nice reflective values. Notice how we can see all the different clouds in the sky being reflected off the material now. So that's roughness, but what if we want to make our material metallic? Well, go back into first material, and this is where the metallic input comes in really handy. So we need another constant vector, and we could get it by selecting that node and pressing Ctrl and D to duplicate it, or I can get it from the palette, and of course I can right click and simply type in constant. So normally when I am getting nodes in, I just right click and type in the name of the node and press enter to bring it in. So I'm going to give this a value right now of 1. Since by default there is no metallic value, it's set to 0. So setting it to 1 and plugging it into metallic will make this blue pretty metallic. And in fact, let's go change the color to something orangey, press apply. And now we made a gold material. It's very important to point out that Unreal Engine's material system is based off of physically based rendering, or PBR for short. For example, right now I have a project open up to demonstrate PBR values, and the two main ones to know about are metallic and roughness. We've already played with them, and essentially both of them are on a scale from 0 to 1. Now by default, metallic is set to 0, so there is no metallicness on the material, and our roughness is set to 0.5. Now as I bring down the roughness, we see our material get shinier and shinier. And then if I bring it up, our material gets rougher and rougher. So if I bring it all the way down to 0 and play with the metallic value, which is right now as default value of 0, so it's not metallic, but slowly we can see it goes from a plastic material all the way to a very shiny gold material. And if we play with a roughness value, we can really see those changes taking effect. Now, both these values are clamped from 0 to 1. So let's say if we input a roughness value of -1, then it'll be clamped to 0. Or if we go above 1, then it's going to clamp it down to just 1. So keep that in mind that if you do try to input a value that's outside the 0 to 1 range, you won't see any changes. And it's important to point out that generally for metallic values, we never go in between 0 and 1. You won't really see a material that's 0.5 metallic. Instead, materials are either all the way 0 or all the way 1. Here I am back in our original project, and you notice that we no longer have our material opened up here. Well, that's fine. You can always open up the material on any object by clicking on that object, and then in the details panel, we see all the materials that are currently on top of that object. So just double click to open up our original material we created. Alternatively, you'll see a little magnifying icon right there. If I select that, then it's automatically going to jump to that material's location in our content drawer. And we can double click to open it up right there like that. So the PBR sliders we were just playing with are the metallic and roughness values right here. So those sliders correspond with these values. So hopefully you understand exactly what they do now. Now I'm going to make a slight edit. So for metallic, let's bring it from 1 to its default value of 0. So that's how it's kind of like a plastic material right now. And also, I think it's a little bit too bright. So double clicking on the color, I'm able to decrease the brightness by playing with its value. So bring it down a little bit, press OK, press apply. And now I do think we have a nice material, but normally when you have plastic outside, it wouldn't be this uniformly shiny. you would expect dirt to pile on this material and make some areas of the material rougher than others. So let's jump into first material, and to add a texture, press Ctrl and space. Let's go into starter content. Since starter content comes with a bunch of textures under the textures folder, and the texture I want to use is specifically T_Perlin noise. So to get a texture into your material, simply left mouse button and hold, drag it in, and let go like that. Alternatively, you can right click, type in texture sample, select that, and then within the details panel, in the drop down of texture, go ahead and find whatever texture you want to use and select it. So that's alternative way to add in a texture. And now that we have T_Perlin noise, if we open it up, we can see that it's just black and white. All the pixels of the texture represent a value in between 0 and 1. So they are perfect to plug into either metallic or roughness. Plug our texture into roughness since I wanted to drive the roughness value of our material, and delete the old node since I no longer need it. Press apply, jump back into our material example. And now if I angle it with the sun, and here's a nice tip, if I hold down Control and L at the same time, I'm able to rotate that sun. So I'm able to bring it down, like move it around, and see what our material looks like in different lighting scenarios. And right now our material is looking a lot more realistic. We can see that because of our material, all the black spots represent shiny areas and all the white spots represent rough areas, which gives our material a nice smudgy look to it to just break up that uniform shininess. At this point, let's switch up the colors. Since if I go into color mode by going Alt-3 for unlit, we can see that's still all one uniform color. Pressing Alt-4 to go back into lit mode, I want it where all the smudges are a different color that's a little bit more brown than orange to represent dirt. So let's go back into first material, and we can duplicate this by pressing Ctrl and D, or we can right click and type in constant 3 vector and select that. So double click on this. I'm going to give it a brownish color, maybe like right here, press OK. And now I want to lerp in between the orange color and the brown color, depending on our alpha texture. So wherever there's white, I want it to pick brown, and whenever there's black, I want it to pick orange. And we can do this through a linear interpolate node. So right click, type in linear, and then interpolate, select that. Or a shortcut is to hold down the L key and left click. So L left click brings in the lerp node, since we are going to be using that node a lot. And on the subject of hotkeys, if I hold down 3 and left click, that gives us a constant 3 vector for color. Or if I hold down 1 and left click, that gives us a basic scalar value, like for metallic and roughness. So 1 and left click for scalar value, 3 and left click for color. So let's plug this up to A, plug the brown one to B, and for alpha texture, I want it to lerp depending on our original mask that's right now driving our roughness. So drag RGB into alpha and drag that all into base color. And now we can see that where our object isn't shiny, the color changes to a dirty brown. Pressing apply, jumping back in here, we notice that our material is definitely a lot more realistic. You can imagine that this was once plastic or really shiny paint, and over time dirt has slowly started to build up on the material, making it pretty dirty. Now we can make this even better by, instead of lerping in between two colors, we're lerping in between a color and another texture. So there's a very good texture under starter content textures, and it is right here. So it's T_metal rust. Open this up, we can see what it is, but right now we don't notice anything. That's because the alpha channel is turned on, and the alpha channel handles opacity. So if you ever open up a texture and you don't see anything, make sure you come up to A and uncheck that. So now we can see it. And while this is rust, I do think it functions well as dirt, especially for a very small detail. Like on this material, it's going to be hard to tell that this is rust instead of dirt. So let's drag this onto our material graph and plug it up right there instead of the original dirt, and press apply. So congratulations, you just made your first material in Unreal Engine 5. While it's not the best, it definitely is a good introduction to the power of the material graph. Before we continue, we first have to download some free assets I created for this tutorial to help us learn Unreal Engine. You can find a link to download the free assets in the description of this video. The reason why is because in this section, we're going to go over how we can take a texture and import that texture into Unreal Engine and use it in one of our materials. So to begin, I've already downloaded the assets for this tutorial. Right here, intro to Unreal 5.zip. Double click to go inside of it and double click to go into intro Unreal 5. So I want to make sure that I do unzip some of these assets, specifically the beginner assets folder. To unzip it, simply drag it onto our desktop. We are going to go over castle assets and intro Unreal project in just a bit, but for now we don't need these. So I'm going to exit out my zip folder, and now we have a brand new folder with a bunch of assets we're going to import into Unreal Engine 5. So to begin, we're going to create a very simple material using these three textures right here. You could probably guess that Spanish pavement color handles the color of the texture, Spanish pavement roughness handles how rough the texture is, and the normal map, which is this purple texture. While it does look pretty weird, don't worry, we are going to go over what a normal map is in just a second. But for now, let's go import all three of these into Unreal Engine 5. So let's open up Content Drawer and go into My Stuff, because you remember we created a folder called My Stuff to hold all our assets. And I'm going to hold down my left mouse button and drag all these assets into my Content Drawer. So you want to make sure that your Content Drawer is open so you are able to drag it in, let go, and automatically these three textures have imported. So we'll notice that all three of these textures have little asterisks right there that tells us that these textures need to be saved. So select all of them and press Ctrl S, or we could have clicked on Save All. So if I double click on Spanish base color, we can see that the texture has successfully been imported into Unreal Engine 5 and sRGB is turned on. For color textures, we want to make sure sRGB is turned on. For everything else, such as masks and normal maps, we want sRGB turned off. For Spanish pavement roughness, we see that's turned on. I'm going to check this to false and save it. Now for our normal map, if I double click on the normal map, Unreal is smart enough to know that this is a normal map, so it already automatically sets some of the parameters. sRGB is turned off, which is what we want, and compression setting is set to normal map. Now, if you do import a normal map and Unreal doesn't know it's a normal map, then you want to make sure that you set compression settings to normal map and sRGB turned off. So let's go create our material by right clicking, go to materials, call this one M underscore Spanish pavement. Now you do not have to add the M underscore in front of our name, but just for convention, I like to add M underscore over all of my materials to tell me just by quickly reading the name of the asset that this is a material. So double click to go into M underscore Spanish pavement, and let's dock it up here so we can switch in between our level and our material graph. Now I'm going to press Control and space, and I could drag in each texture individually, or I can hold down Shift and select all of them and drag in all of them at once. So I'm going to leave my normal map off to the side since we are going to go over this in a bit, but let's just handle our roughness and our base color. So base color will go into, of course, base color, and roughness will go into roughness. Now we don't have to play with the metallic value because metallic by default is set to 0. Because our material is a metallic, we can leave the metallic input empty since it will just default to 0. And within material example level, let's apply this brand new material to our floor. Right away, I notice that there are two issues with the material. Number one, our material is tiling way too much. It's too small. And number two, there is no depth. There is no shadows given by the crevices of our Spanish pavement. It's almost as if someone got wallpaper and plastered it onto the floor trying to pretend like it's real flooring. So to fix this, we use normal maps. So essentially what normal maps do is that they fake bumps. So they fake depth and they make it look like our texture actually has height when in reality it doesn't. It's just a material. So to add a normal map, it's pretty simple. As you can probably guess, we grab the normal map and simply drag it into normal. So let's press apply and immediately we'll see that our texture looks a lot better. There's actual depth, and if we come to the shadow right here and add in a basic light, we can see that as I move this light around, the material itself is casting shadow. So since the light is right here, now the crevices have a little bit of a shadow. So normal maps really go a long way to make our material look really realistic. Now let's fix our tiling, because in my opinion, I think it's tiling way too much right now. And to fix tiling, let's go into M underscore Spanish pavement, and we're going to use a brand new node. So right click type in texture coordinates. So let's grab that. Essentially, texture coordinates will allow us to change the scale of our textures. So if we just drag it into UVs, nothing will happen. That's because we need to hold down M and left click to add in a multiply node. Or we can right click and type in multiply, since we are going to be multiplying the value that comes out of texture coordinates. And on a side note, if you ever want to break wires, hold down Alt and left mouse button to break it. So let's move multiply up here like this. Hold down the left mouse button and drag it into A, and then drag this out into the UVs, just like this. We can multiply this by a number, which is a constant scalar. So as you can guess, we're going to type in constant and grab one constant. So plug this into B, and let's give this a value of, instead of 1, something smaller, like 0.5. And this will increase the size of our texture to make our Spanish payment bigger. And we can see immediately that it did make the texture bigger. We can maybe even make this a little bit bigger. Let's try 0.35 and press apply. And now I do like the scale of our payment. We can also add in a little bit of customization. So maybe I don't like the tint of this. I want to make our payment a little bit more red or a little bit more green. Well, I can marquee select by holding down the left mouse button anywhere in my graph, select all my nodes, move it back a bit, since we're going to be adding some nodes right here. So I'm going to hold down M and left click again to add in the multiply node and drag RGB into it like this, and then drag it out into base color. I actually want this RGB to go into B, not A. So I could hold down Control and hold down my left mouse button to then grab this wire and place it into B to just switch it from A to B. Now I'm going to hold down 3 and left click to add in a constant 3 vector. And I'm going to set its default value to white and plug this into A. So since R, G, and B are all 111, there's going to be no changes right now with the Spanish payment. But if I want to make our Spanish payment a little bit more red, instead of it being white, I'm going to move it into the red direction and press apply. We can already see a change right there. And now our Spanish payment is really red. So generally you don't want the tint to be that intense. So just a little bit red, kind of like an off-white, and then press apply. Now we do have a more reddish payment, or we can even add some greenish blue, and we subtracted a lot of red from our Spanish payment, and maybe you do like the look of this better. Right now our material looks nice, but there is one big issue, and that is it is not real time. So whenever we make a slight adjustment, we have to press apply and wait for it to compile in order to see changes in our world. And as you can imagine, if we have a really complex material and we make a slight change, the compile time can take a while. So we're able to get around this with parameters. So parameters allow us to make real-time adjustments without any compile time whatsoever. So let's jump into it to show how to use them. Before we create a parameter, we first need to create a material instance. And this material instance will hold all of our parameters. So to create a material instance is pretty easy. First, you want to find the material you want to create an instance of. In our case, it's a Spanish payment. We already have the location open up within our content drawer, but just as a reminder, if you want to find exactly where this material is, select the object with the material on it, and within the details panel, select the little magnifying glass to jump to that location in your content drawer. So here we have m_Spanish payment, and to create a material instance, simply right click on your material and go create material instance. Now, instead of calling it m_Spanish payment, I'm going to call it mi_Spanish payment. So I like to use an M to tell me that this asset is a material, and I like to use mi to tell me that this asset is a material instance. So let's double click to go into the material instance, and we'll see that we don't have any parameters right now. A parameter is essentially a setting that allows us to change our material. And that's because I need to tell Unreal exactly what settings within our material I want to make a parameter, what variables I want exposed to the material instance. So for example, if I want to make this value right here a parameter, right click and go to convert to parameter. It's that easy. Now it's going to ask for a name. Let's call this one size. And now within our material instance, we notice that there was no change because I have to press apply. And now we get a brand new parameter within our material instance called size. Now, before we can play with this, let's go add our material instance to our world. Since this Spanish payment is not our material instance, instead it's m_Spanish payment. So let's go grab our material instance and drag it on there to make it the instance and not the main material. Now, with our material instance opened, I'm going to check size, and let's go play with this value. So I can see that as I increase it, it's all updating in real time. And as I decrease it, I'm able to see exactly the size that I want. So trying to pick a size this way, instead of having to jump into our material, manually edit something, and then click apply and jump back, by just exposing it as a parameter for our material instance, it makes creating materials a lot easier and, in my opinion, a lot more fun. Now, we're not just limited to creating parameters for scalar values. We can even go into m_Spanish payment, and let's turn this color into a parameter. So call this one color tint, and let's go back into material example. And we do not have anything because I forgot to press apply. And this color tint is available to us. So maybe I don't want it to be this kind of greenish. I just want to bring it over to, let's make it even more green like this. I can even bring down the value to make it pretty much no color, just pure black. So we can even give ourselves more control. For example, right now our normal map is doing a pretty good job. But what if we want to decrease the effect of the normal map? Or we want to make this normal map even more intense so that the shadows are more pronounced? Well, if we jump into m_Spanish payment, we can control the intensity of a normal map with the flatten normal node. So let's go hook up the normal map to normal right there, and the result to normal. Now it's asking for a flatness value. If I hover my mouse over it, it says the default value is 0. So I'm going to hold down 1 and left click to create a constant scalar value and hook it up right there. Now I'm going to right click and go convert to parameter. And let's call this one normal flatness, just like that. So 0 won't do anything. Press apply, jump back into our world, and check normal flatness. 0 is its default, there are no changes. But if I increase normal flatness, our normal strength decreases because it's getting more and more flat. But if I make this value go below 0, so into the negative ranges, like -1, then we have some really intense normal maps. Maybe even, let's go -5. Now this is almost like it's from a war zone. We can even add some more adjustments. So let's jump back into m_Spanish payment. And I want to control the intensity of this normal map with just a simple multiply node. So I could select this multiply, press Ctrl and D to duplicate it, or I could hold down M and left click to bring in a multiply node and hook it up like this. Now I want to bring in a parameter scalar value for B, so I could hold down 1 and left click, then right click to convert to parameter, or a shortcut is to hold down the S key and left click to create a constant parameter. And it's going to automatically ask us for a name, call this one roughness, strength, and plug it up like this. And this will immediately get rid of any roughness, make it pure glossy. We don't want that. So let's go increase the strength from 0 to 1, which won't do anything by default. But this gives us the ability within our material instance to then, let's say, increase this roughness strength to make our pavement even more rough. So maybe beforehand it was at 1. You think that this is a little bit too shiny. Well, you could just increase it and get the exact roughness amount you want. So with just a couple of controls within our parameter value, we're able to, in real time, completely change the way our material looks, which is pretty amazing. Now, I prefer the way this material looked like originally, so I can reset all the values to its default value by clicking on the arrow icon. So set that to 0, 1, 0.35, and set it back to a little bit off green. Now that we know how to create material instances, it's now time to go over master materials. Essentially, a master material is one material to rule them all. So imagine we have a single material, and from this material, a bunch of material instances are created that are very different from each other. These instances can be anything from paint, concrete, wood, pretty much anything you can imagine, and they all share the exact same master material. So I know what I just said sounded a little bit complicated, but it's best to show with an example. We've already done a lot of the work creating a master material, and it's actually m_Spanish payment. So we're going to turn this into a generic material from which we can create multiple materials from. So let's jump back into our map, and within the content drawer, instead of calling this M underscore Spanish payment, let's right click and go rename and call this one M underscore master material. Just like that. So let's double click on it. And I want to make this master material pretty generic. So I want all my parameters to have the default values where if I didn't edit any of them, it would basically be the same as if we plugged in all 3 of these textures without any of those edits. So down here, normal flatness won't make any edits or changes to the normal map, which is what we want. Normal strength is right now set to 1, which will not change the roughness map or make it more rough or more shiny. Also, I noticed I misspelled strength, so let's go fix that. And up here, color tint isn't pure white. If it was pure white, then it wouldn't edit the base color, but it's an off green right now. So I want to make this pure white. Let's double click on this, and I can do so by grabbing the saturation and bringing it all the way down like that. So now we have 1, 1, 1, and make sure your value right here is all the way up to the top like that. Now we have pure white, which isn't making any edits to the base color. Now we are making an edit to the multiply node right here. So this is a size of 0.35. So it's going to decrease the tiling and make our texture a lot bigger than what it would be by default. So I would need to set this to its default of 1 right there. So let's press apply. And as a reminder, if I open up mi underscore Spanish payment, essentially by changing the values within the master material in a material instance, we see size right here is 0.35. To change it to its default, all you have to do is click on the arrow like that. So for color tint, it's right now green, which is what it was originally. If I click on the arrow, now it's pure white. So let's go back. And I also want to expose the textures right here. So I want to be able to swap out each of these textures on the material instance. To do so, you can probably guess, of course, we're going to right click and go to convert to parameter. Call this one color, right click right here, roughness, and right click, convert to parameter, normal. So let's press apply. And now we get access to all those textures right here. So if I just turn and activate all of these, I can switch out any of these textures for something else. For example, I can switch it out with grass. And now we have grass as our base color, but our roughness is still using the Spanish payment and the normal map. So I'm going to press Ctrl and Z to get rid of that. But you can imagine that if we did have a normal map for grass and a roughness for grass, that I could just swap it out really quickly. And instead of it being a Spanish payment, it is now grass. But our master material isn't complete yet. It is missing one function, and that is allowing for metallic maps. Since our Spanish payment right now isn't metallic, but what if we did have a metallic material and we want to use our master material? Unfortunately, there is no place that we can put a metallic map. So let's jump into m underscore master material and let's add that right here. So we're just going to duplicate the roughness map. So press Ctrl C, Ctrl V, because just like the roughness map, the metallic map is a mask that shows where in the texture the material should be metallic. And instead of calling it roughness, call this one metallic. Drag it up right here. That's why I was using the same UVs. And simply plug this into metallic. Now we do have the issue, and that is now even a material like our Spanish payment, which is a metallic, will have metallic values by default, which is something we don't want. So we want the ability to be able to turn on and off this metallic map right here. So let's jump into m underscore master material, and we could give ourselves a toggle for this with the static switch parameter and select it right there. So let's call this one is metallic. And then if it is, then we're going to use the metallic map. But if it's not, we're going to use the default value of metallic, which is just 0. So hold down 1 and left click to bring in a constant scalar value. And by default, it is 0. So plug it up like this. And now we have a nice switch where, let's say, for example, if we do have a metallic material, all we have to do in the material instance is check is metallic to true and drag in that metallic map right here. But if I turn it off, then it gets rid of that metallic map. So let me go make some adjustments to our Spanish payment, bring down the size. Also, it's a little bit too reflective right now. So I'm going to increase the roughness strength just a little bit to make it a little bit less shiny. And now we have a pretty versatile master material that we can use for a whole range of different scenarios. And we're going to use this master material in the next chapter. Now that we can import textures and have a master material, let's go over how we can import 3D objects and bring them into Unreal Engine. And it's very important to know that in Unreal Engine, 3D objects are called static meshes. And static meshes, by itself, are just a collection of vertices and faces in space. If you want to change the way that object looks, then we need to add on a material, and generally this material is comprised of multiple textures. So to break down how a 3D asset is constructed in Unreal Engine, first we have our static mesh, which is a plain 3D object. And then to change the way that static mesh looks, we need to add a material. And this material can be comprised of multiple textures. So to better get a sense of how 3D assets are made, let's create our own 3D asset in Unreal Engine. The 3D object we're going to be importing into Unreal Engine right now is included within the beginner assets. So double click to open this up, and it's the woodcrate.fbx. So we're going to import this into Unreal Engine. If I double click on it to see what this 3D model is, we can see that it's just a very simple crate. So nothing too fancy, but it will get the point across on how we create 3D assets in Unreal Engine. So let's go into content drawer, and under my stuff, I'm going to save everything, right click, let's create a brand new folder, call this one wooden crate. Let's double click to go inside of it. So wooden crate will have all our assets that combine to create the wooden crate asset. So first, let's import the 3D model. So hold down left mouse button, drag it, and simply let go. Now we have a bunch of FBX import options. Generally, I keep it at default. If you do see something is different, click on reset the default to get those default values back. Now, generally, under materials, for create new materials, I do not create a material. Since we are not going to be starting from scratch, we're going to be using the master material on this. And for import textures, uncheck that to false since we aren't going to be importing any textures, since I'd rather import those textures manually, and click on import. So we might get this warning, that's fine, you can ignore that. And now if I double click on the wood crate, we can see that our wooden crate has been successfully imported into Unreal Engine 5. I can drag this out into my scene, scale it, rotate it, move it around. Pretty much it has all the same functionalities as any of the objects that Unreal Engine comes with. So that's how you import a 3D object. Let's go over how we can create a material for this 3D object. Now, luckily for us, we've already done most of the work, and that is our master material. So m_master material has everything that we need to create a material for this object, except the textures. So let's import the textures real quickly. Press Ctrl and space to bring up the content drawer. Select all of them with Shift and drag them into the content drawer. So let's double check that all our maps are correct, starting with the base color, and sRGB is turned on, which is exactly what we want. Would crate_metallic should have sRGB turned off since this is a mask. And this fancy texture right here we are going to ignore, but I will go over it in just a bit. And right there is woodcrate_normal. Let's double click, make sure that it was imported as a normal map. sRGB is turned off, and compression settings is set to normal map, which is exactly what we want. And for roughness, of course, since this is a roughness mask, make sure sRGB is turned off. So let's go save everything and create a material instance of our master material. So let's right click, create material instance, and call this one mi_wooden crate. So drag this into our wooden crate folder and move here. So double click, and we have our material instance. So I'm going to apply this to our crate, and obviously it's using the wrong textures. So let's open up our material instance for wooden crate and activate color, normal, and roughness. So let's drag those textures that we want, specifically color into base color, roughness into roughness, and normal into normal. Our material is almost complete, but we are missing one last thing, and that is the metallic map to make our nails metallic. So to do so, this is why we added the is metallic switch right here. And now we get the metallic texture. Let's turn this on, find where our metallic map is, and simply drag it onto texture and let go like that. And now our nails are metallic. We can see it successfully reflecting the sun. So that's pretty amazing how very quickly we were able to automate the process of creating a material by using our master material. So we could create a material without ever even touching the material graph by just creating an instance of that master material. And what's amazing is that we still have access to all the parameters right here. So I can change the normal flatness to -5 to increase the normals, or I can go into roughness strength and decrease the roughness value to make our box even shinier. I can even go into color tint and give it a slightly orangey reddish tint. Now, it is important that if you do drag a texture onto an object and the texture looks like this, so it looks completely out of sync, that's because the size value most likely is not 1. So come into size and make sure that it's set to 1 as its default value. So now we have a nice box asset. I can hold on Alt, duplicate this, maybe scale it up, and even drag it from the content browser. But now we do have an issue, and that is when we drag a box from the content browser, it does not have the material we just created. So to set our box's default material, we need to open up the asset static mesh editor. And within here, we see that we have a default material slot. Right now it's using the world grid material. We're going to set this to mi_wooden like that, press save. And now that material is applied to all our boxes, even when we drag out a brand new box. Before we move on to the next chapter, I think it's important to point out what this texture right here does. So I'm going to double click on it, and this texture does look a little bit weird, but essentially what it is that it combines several different masks into one texture using the RGB channels. And I know that might sound confusing, but essentially in computer graphics, color is made up of a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. So what developers realize is that they can take these individual channels and then hide masks inside of them. So for example, if we uncheck the blue channel and the green channel, we see that the red channel of this texture is our metallic mask. Uncheck red, check green, our green channel is roughness, uncheck green, and check blue. Our blue channel is ambient occlusion, although we won't use ambient occlusion. I included it within a texture to show that we can hide 3 different masks inside a single texture. And because even though this is a color texture, it's actually going to be used as masks, we want to uncheck sRGB right there. So the way we would use this in a material is let's create a brand new material, call this one mask example, and double click to go inside of it. So if we were to create a material from this mask, I'm going to drag out our base color in our normal map, because of course we still need them. And instead of using our metallic or our roughness texture, we combine those into one individual texture right here. So we don't need those since they're combined into this one. And our red channel is metallic, so I'm going to grab from the R pin into metallic, and our green channel is roughness. Now roughness didn't have to be the green channel, it could have been blue or red, just I decided to use the green channel. And if I press apply, inside of our map, let's apply the new material to this crate. And right now there is a slight difference between the two, since in the material instance, I am using color tint. So reset that back to white, and jumping back here, we can see that there's virtually no difference in between combining the textures or using the textures separately. So I included it within this course because it's pretty important to know why Unreal developers use this, since you will be seeing this a lot. Also, it's good to know exactly what these R, G, and B pins are used for. That is how you create Unreal assets, but you're probably wondering now, how do I move Unreal assets in between different Unreal projects? Because it would be a real shame if every time we create a new project, we have to remake all the assets. And we can move assets in between projects through an easy process called migration. So to migrate assets in between 2 Unreal projects, of course we need a new Unreal project. Included within the downloadable content, link in the description below, is a project that contains some assets I want to bring into our first project that we've been working on. So within the zip file, go into it, and it's specifically intro Unreal project. So just drag it onto our desktop to unzip it, and double click to go inside of the project folder. To open up an Unreal project, double click on the .u project. Now that I have the downloaded project open up, if I press Ctrl and space, we can see all the content that's currently inside of it. Now, if your content folder is empty, then that means you didn't unzip the project. So make sure you do unzip the project before opening it up. So I have a folder called Lighting Examples with some maps, materials, meshes, and textures that are going to help us demonstrate Unreal's lighting capabilities. I want to bring all of these assets into our original project called First Project. So to do so, I'm going to dock them to the sides of my screen. And let's go open up our content drawer. So what I'm going to do is copy our lighting examples folder, which is right here, and bring it into another project. To do so, we use a process called migration, and migration is really simple. Simply hover over the assets you want to bring into another Unreal project, right-click, and select Migrate. Now it's going to give us a list of all the assets that are going to be migrated, and this all looks correct. So I'm going to click on OK. And now it's asking for a location to migrate them to. We specifically want to migrate them into the content folder of the destination project. And you can find out where the content folder is by double-clicking on the original project file. So right here is first project, which is where this project is stored. And if I go into its project file, we see that there's a content folder, and this is the location that I want to migrate all these assets to. So I could go through and manually navigate to this location, or I can copy its destination with Control-C and Control-V it right here. So now I have the content folder of our original project selected. I'm telling Unreal that I want to move the files from Intro Unreal project to first project. And click on select folder. So now we can see content migration successful. And if I go into first project now, press Control and space, under content, we now have lighting examples, which are all the same assets from our downloaded project. Now an alternative, that's so we don't have to go and find where our project file is located. In order to get the content folder's location, I could press Control and space to go into the content drawer and right click on our content folder and go show and explore. This will automatically bring up the content folder from our project. Finally, let's talk about Unreal Engine 5's brand new lighting system called Lumen. And Lumen is revolutionary because it gives us real-time global illumination. And essentially, global illumination is just a very fancy term for light bounce. Because in real life, light doesn't just hit an object and stop. Instead, it hits an object, bounces off that object, and after each bounce, it illuminates the world. It also takes a little bit of that object's color and projects it onto the next object. For example, it might be a little bit hard to see because the video is being streamed, but here we have a red mouse, and light is hitting this mouse, taking a little bit of its color, and then projecting it onto any nearby objects. So if I move the mouse to the table, around the table, there's a little bit of a reddish tint that's coming from the bounce lighting. So global illumination is important because it's the secret to realistic rendering. But there's one large problem, and that is global illumination is very expensive to calculate. Real-time global illumination isn't possible without a super powerful GPU. And this is where Lumen comes in handy. Lumen is a brand new way to render global illumination at the fraction of a cost compared to traditional ways to get global illumination like hardware ray tracing. So to show Lumen in action, let's jump back into Unreal. And to do so, we need the content that we just migrated over. So if you haven't already, make sure you download the lighting examples, link in the description below, and migrate it into our project from the previous chapter. So to begin, let's go to Maps and Light Bounce. So as we can see, this is an insanely simple room. All we have is 4 walls and 2 objects and a light source. I've also gone ahead and added in a post-process volume. Since by default Lumen is turned on, I want to turn off Lumen to demonstrate how we used to get global illumination back in the Unreal Engine 4 days. So as we can see, global illumination method is set to none. Now let's just pretend that we're in Unreal Engine 4 and I want some global illumination since obviously shadows are never this dark. Normally you would see some light bouncing around to illuminate the shadow areas right here. So the first thing I would do is number 1, make sure my light sources are set to static, not movable. And number 2, I need to build my level. And to build, you want to come up to the Build tab all the way up here, select it, and within the dropdown, simply select Build All Levels. Right now, behind the scenes, Unreal is ray tracing our entire level and creating a light map. This light map contains all the lighting data, which it then overlays onto our world as a texture. Now we are done building our lighting. It should have been pretty quick because this is a very small level. And if we look at our level, we can see that we do have global illumination. Notice how this sphere is no longer pitch black in the shadow areas. There's now light filling up the shadows, making it look a lot more realistic than beforehand. We can even see that there's some red on the sphere that's bouncing from the red wall. Same thing over here. The entire room has a little bit of a greenish tint since this green wall is also bouncing light off. So this is how we used to get global illumination in Unreal Engine 4. And while this is great, there are some major issues. Mostly that our lighting and all our shadows are static. So if I select my sphere and move it around, we can see that the lighting breaks. Press Ctrl Z to undo that. Then even if I select my light source and move it around, the lighting also breaks. Notice how if I move my light away, we now have two shadows. So there's one shadow that's coming from the light source and another shadow that's coming from our light map, which is no good. So I'm press Ctrl and Z to put our lighting back at the original spot. And this is where Lumen comes in really handy because it allows us to have dynamic global illumination. So I can move my light around and move my sphere with no issues whatsoever. But first, we have to get rid of our light map since we did bake our world. To do so, you need the World Settings tab. Now, by default, there is no World Settings tab. We can get that by coming up to Windows and selecting World Settings all the way down here. And now we have our World Settings. As you can guess, World Settings is simply the settings of our world. So this is where we would control our light baking. And we will go over light baking settings in just a bit. But for now, I want to get rid of our light maps by selecting Force No Pre-Computed Lighting, which will tell Unreal that I don't want to use any light maps and I don't want to build our lighting. And then after I set that to true, make sure you press build. Now that didn't build our lighting. Instead, it went through and it got rid of all of our light map textures. So let's come back to details. And now I'm going to set my light source to movable. So now that it's set to movable, we still aren't getting any global illumination because if you remember in the post-process volume, I turned off Lumen. So let me zoom in a little bit so that we can see this better. Here is Unreal Engine 5 without Lumen, and here is Unreal Engine 5 with Lumen. So this is without, and this is with. And what's amazing is that I can move this light around, and there are no issues. I can even move this sphere and make it bigger, smaller, and Unreal is calculating all this global illumination at a very smooth frame rate, which is absolutely amazing. This was not possible in Unreal Engine 4. So if I grab this light, and even if I move it all the way over here, we can see that there's bounce lighting coming from the light hitting the wall, and then bouncing and hitting the sphere, giving our entire sphere a little bit of a reddish tint on the right side, which is very realistic. We could even come into the point light settings and gives ourselves a softer shadow by increasing the source radius. So if I increase this, notice that the shadows get softer and softer. Global illumination used to be pretty expensive since you'd have to use hardware ray tracing, but now, thanks to Lumen, it's accessible to everyone, while running at a smooth frame rate depending on your computer. And something that was not possible in UE4, even with hardware ray tracing, is that if I come into lighting examples, materials, and use M_emissive material, our emissive materials give off light. So I'm able to light up a scene by just using our materials, which is really amazing. So I'm going to press Ctrl and Z to undo those, since now it's time to go over all the different light sources that Unreal Engine has to offer. So to begin, let's talk about the point light. So I'm going to delete it, and to get a point light, you want to come up to the Add button, of course, and under Lights, drag in a point light. So the point light is the most basic of lights. It's just a point that emits light in all directions. So let's go over the most important settings in the details panel. And probably the most important one right now is intensity. So it's at 8 candelas. I can bring this down to 1, 2, or even something insanely large like 100 to change the power of the light source. But for now, I'm going to leave this at 4. We also have the source radius, which I just went over. But if we increase it and make sure that you do have game view turned off up here, you can see that there is and hopefully you can't see this a little bit better with the red background. We have the outline of a yellow sphere. And this sphere basically tells us the size of our light emission. And the larger our yellow sphere is, then the more soft our shadows will be. And as I decrease this all the way back down to its default of 0, we get some really harsh shadows. So if we want to soften that up, bring up the source radius. Now right below that, we have temperature. So temperature allows us to change how warm or cold our light source is. If I bring this down, our light source gets warmer and warmer. And if I bring this up, it gets colder and colder. And I can disable temperature by clicking on the temperature button. And all the way down here, we have light color. So as you can guess, light color just changes the color of our light. The controls are exactly the same as our materials. And above all these is the indirect lighting intensity. So right now it's set at 1. When I set it to 0, we're going to have very little bounce light, and our shadows end up like beforehand where they're pretty dark. Not much bounce lighting is happening. Or instead of 1, which is its default, I can bring it up to 10, and now we have a lot of bounce lighting. So I'm just going to leave it at 1 for now. So those were all the main settings for point lights. I'm going to delete that, and let's go over the next light right now, and that is the spotlight. The spotlight is very similar to the point light, although unlike the point light, the spotlight is just illuminating one direction. And you could change the direction the light is pointing by, of course, rotating it. The settings are the exact same as the point light, except we have an inner and outer cone angle. So the outer cone angle will control the size of our spotlight, and the inner cone angle will control the fall off of our light. So I'm going to go to game view mode so we can better see this. And as I increase the inner cone angle, we can see that our lighting gets sharper and sharper and sharper. And if I decrease it all the way to 0, there's a very soft fall off. So those are the controls for the spotlight. I'm going to delete that and go into the next one. And that is the rectangle light. So rectangle light is pretty similar to the spotlight and directional light, except now we're emitting from a rectangle pointing in a specific direction. Hopefully you can see the outline of the light when it's against the wall. And I control the size of the rectangle by going into source width and increasing the width, or I can increase the height. I can even, just like beforehand, play with the fall off by decreasing the barn door angle from 88 all the way to 0. And hopefully you can better see it from this angle, what the barn door is. Or I can increase the length. So we have a lot of control over the specific fall off of that rectangle light. Other than that, the controls are the same. So let's delete that. And next up is probably the light you're going to be using the most, the directional light. So we don't see anything with the directional light right now because I have to rotate it to see what it does. And as you can guess, this is the sunlight. So the sunlight is pointing in a specific direction infinitely. And just like the spotlight, if I rotate this around, I'm able to control the direction of our sun. The directional light has pretty much the same exact controls as our point light, except if I zoom in on the shadows, we get source angle. Bringing up the source angle makes the shadows smoother, and bringing down the source angle makes the shadows sharper. So I'm going to reset its value by clicking on the arrow icon, and I'm going to delete our directional light since there's one last light I want to show, and that is the skylight. So let's drag in the skylight, and you'll notice nothing is happening. And the reason why is because the skylight is pretty unique. Essentially what it does is that it captures our sky and then it projects it onto our world. And right now our skylight isn't doing anything because obviously our world doesn't have any sky. So the way we can add sky is pretty simple in Unreal Engine 5. You just want to come up to the add button, come all the way down to visual effects, and drag in a sky and atmosphere. Simply place it right there. And again, if I look up, we don't have any sky since the sky requires a directional light, which is the sunlight. So let's also come up to add, down to lights, and drag in a directional light for our sky. Now, if our skylight isn't working, then it has to be refreshed by going into the details panel and turning on and off effects world. Now, the reason why I know the lighting in our room right now is from the sky and not from the directional light is because the directional light is not hitting the inside of our room. So if I move it around, then we can see that our directional light is illuminating our room. But if I move it, that's how it's coming from the back. The lighting is entirely coming from the skylight. And we can see this better by hiding and unhiding the skylight by using the effects world right there. So here the skylight is being used and here the skylight isn't. So this is without skylight and this is with skylight. And something that's pretty cool about the skylight is that if I add in a cube, so let's come up to shapes, cube, drag that in, scale that up, we can make a makeshift door. And now notice how as I move my cube, the skylight slowly starts to illuminate our room. So that's why the skylight is a pretty big deal, since it allows us to capture our sky and project it onto our world as lumen lighting. And finally, it's time to go over lumen settings. So these are settings that affect all of our lumen lighting before we move on to lighting and environment, completely from scratch. So I'm going to delete everything. And I'm just going to add in a simple point light once again, because I want to show and also decrease the intensity to 4. And this is probably something you've noticed, is that there is a lot of noise, especially in the shadows. Now, I don't know if it shows up due to the YouTube compression, but if you are following along with the tutorial, you can see a lot of that noise. And to get rid of that noise, we need to play with the lumen